Gather near, mystical investigators, and step into the nook. Tonight, we're travelling back over 2 centuries into the Red River settlement in Adams, Tennessee, to the year 1817, a place where the soil itself seemed to harbour a deep, unholy malice. Grab your drinks, grab your blankets, and settle in for what lies ahead. Adams, Tennessee wasn't just a settlement. It was a claustrophobic frontier where survival relied on the Red River Baptist Church. The misery began with a bitter financial land dispute between John Bell and his neighbour Benjamin Batts. Contrary to popular belief, his spat was not with Kate. It was her brother-in-law Benjamin. In 1817, excommunication from the church was a very big thing. Being excommunicated from the Red River Baptist Church was a devastating event for anybody. It wasn't just a spiritual penalty. It meant total social ostracization. The community would cut off ties, refuse to do business with you, and you were completely cut out from all social and religious life, essentially turning you into an outcast in the frontier. John was excommunicated largely due to the bitter, very public land dispute he had with Benjamin Batts. This involved accusations of dishonesty and unfair dealings. This created immense social pressure and stress on the family, isolating them during a highly vulnerable time and making Adams, Tennessee, a very difficult place for them to remain. So I want to ask you, mystical investigators, if you lived in Adams in 1817, would you have stood by the bells, or would you have been among the thousands who fled in terror? Let me know your theories in the comments. John's first encounter with the entity was a huge dog with a head in the shape of a rabbit. When he let off a shot at the strange animal, it vanished before his eyes. John couldn't believe what he had seen. The family heard scratching all around the cabin that night. They would hear dogs fighting, rats gnawing in the walls, all in the dead of night. We know it wasn't just the family's imagination, because of the neighbours. Brave souls like one man who was close to the bells stayed the night, only to be tossed from his bed, his clothes shredded by a force that felt like rough, cold leather, while a voice mocked him from the empty air. The entity became audible and terrified the family with her shrill voice, onslaught of verbal abuse, and her uncanny ability to predict future events. I'll expand on this later. To truly grasp the horror, we have to understand the pressure cooker that was Adams, Tennessee. The Red River Baptist Church was the centre of social gravity. In 1817, being excommunicated was not just a religious scolding, it was a social death sentence. When the feud between John Bell and his neighbour Benjamin Batts began, the community didn't just watch, they judged. Agatha, you've seen enough of these societal pressures throughout history. Was this entity a physical spirit, or did the crushing weight of community, being exiled and the harshness of life back then, and of course the bitterness of the land dispute between John and Benjamin that affected the whole society, could that have been so intense that it began to manifest as something else entirely? Something like, I think they call it an egregore?
By externalizing the trauma, by blaming an invisible spectral tormentor, the community effectively bleached the bones of a truly domestic tragedy. It turned human cruelty, financial ruin, and the suffocating pressure of 19th century societal expectations into a campfire story.
Exactly. You think the isolation itself was the catalyst? The witch wasn't born of spite, but of a collective misery, of a dying faith. That's very interesting as a theory. As some of us who follow or study the paranormal, like me, there are instances or theories that strongly suggest that the coming together of highly charged energies like these would have been and can create such strong power that it collects and manifests as spirits. And what then happens is it mirrors the emotion of the society in which it was born from. The more people that visit that area, the stronger the energy it pulls and gathers together, keeping the spirit very much there. The entity's cruelty was personal. While it showed a mocking, almost protective kindness to Lucy, which was indeed strange in itself, it broke Betsy and John. We do also have to acknowledge the enslaved staff, because back then slavery was still very much in its height of being. So the staff that worked for the Bells, they were the first to feel and see or hear the heavy dragging footsteps and the cold static air that preceded the attacks, proving a perspective history often chose to ignore. The entity's dislike for them was absolute, often tormenting and terrifying them relentlessly. One of the Bell family's enslaved men, Dean, reported encountering the spirit multiple times on his walks around the fields. It would appear to him as a large black dog or wolf, sometimes with two heads or even no head at all. Dean even claimed the entity would turn him into a mule and attack him, which led him to carry an axe and a homemade protective amulet everywhere for protection. Imagine being Betsy. Think of yourself back in 1817, where the rules were so much different to what they are now. Imagine being a young woman. Invisible hands would slap her in the face right in front of her parents, leaving red, stinging welts that appeared in seconds. Beyond the slaps and the whispers, the entity would physically pull her hair and throw household objects across the room whenever she tried to pray or read scripture, which is very much like poltergeist activity, which is usually a, a standard spirit, not something that was created from an egregore. But I myself do need to do some more research into egregores. They do interest me immensely. If any of you down on the comments have any further information on egregores, I would be really interested to chat with you about them. There were also reports of the spirit pinching her severely, leaving bruises that would bloom on her skin in full view of the family. So imagine being sat there, you could be at the table eating your dinner, and all of a sudden she'll jump up and she's covered in bruises on her arms that weren't there 2 seconds ago. Could you believe your eyes if something like that happened? At night, a strange phenomenon would happen. She would suffer from sleep paralysis, which I myself have suffered from, and I imagine there's probably more of you out there that have also suffered this peculiar phenomenon. For those of you that don't know what sleep paralysis is, being paralysed in your sleep, but you wake up and you cannot move a muscle. Now, the scientific explanation for this is that the switch in the back of your brain that tells your body it's now time to wake up doesn't flick back where it should. So your body is still in a state of sleep while your mind is very much awake. And sometimes it can be terrifying because I've experienced it myself, where you very much feel like this is being caused by an entity, not a switch in the back of your brain. You can almost feel, in fact, you can feel the pressing down on your chest, it getting tighter and tighter, then all of a sudden, the release, where you're fine and you can now move, and it's incredibly strange. Also, she would whisper, or the entity would whisper, distorted, gravelly insults about her suitor, Joshua Gardner, mocking his social standing and his character. Betsy and Joshua were indeed engaged and intended to marry. This was a arranged marriage. There are reports that Betsy herself wasn't overly keen on this situation. I will dive into that in just a second. The entity also was a mimic. Now, a mimic is something of another phenomenon in the spiritual world, in that it can pick up anyone's voice and use that voice to confuse you, to make you think that you're talking to that person. There are reports where a mimic can even show itself as that person, so as to make it even more believable, which I have not experienced myself, but imagine that would be incredibly scary. The entity would mimic the voices of her own parents, and this was to drive her into a state of total paralysed isolation, feeling that she had no one, that she was alone. We then have the ultimate alibi, Richard Powell. Now, this is the man that Betsy eventually married. He was an accomplished magician and an incredible ventriloquist. He possessed the talent and tools to throw his voice. This is something that accomplished ventriloquists can do. They cause misdirection elsewhere so that it seems that the voice comes from somewhere else in the room. Now, some theories suggest that he may have orchestrated some of the spiritual phenomena to exert control over the family, and thus protecting Betsy, and ultimately to cause the engagement to Garner to end. And this would then make way for him to marry Betsy, which is what they wanted all along. Betsy and Richard did indeed marry and moved to Mississippi. Interestingly, after the engagement to Garner was broken off and Betsy moved to Mississippi with Richard, the witch ceased her verbal torments on Betsy and any suitor, and a lot of the spiritual activity actually calmed down around the frontier. So make of that what you will. John Bell Jr., now he was 24 during the events from the entity. During the first haunting, he patrolled the farm with his brothers looking for a source for the knocking. And that's natural. You hear something knocking around the cabin, you would want to try and go out and find out what that is. Is someone messing around? Is someone creeping around the property at night? So he would take his brothers and they would go looking for a source of the knocking. He also stayed by his father's side. So when John Bell became incredibly sick, and this would often be from the attacks and the viciousness of the witch, John Sr. even developed a facial tic because of the persistent attacks. Now, there are, again, many theories. There's a scientific explanation, but also the paranormal explanation, and I will leave that to you to discuss. John Jr. took some of the poison from the vial that did indeed kill John Sr. It was mixed within one of his regular medicine bottles. It was a black liquid. John took a small droplet of this, and with the help from his friend Alex Gunn, he dropped it on a cat's tongue, and the poor animal died instantly. John threw the vial into the fire, and blue smoke plumed and flames. Now, this is indicative of arsenic. So it was deemed that John Bell did die of arsenic poisoning, but no one knows how that got into his medicine. Joel Bell, thankfully for him, was way too young to have ever remembered the haunting the first time. But he would recall listening fondly to tales from Lucy, his mom, and his brother Richard. Richard did also encounter similar attacks to Betsy, all by the psychological side of interfering in relationships, as he too was young at 6 years old. He was 9 when John Sr. died. Richard was the one who recorded everything in a journal some 26 years later. There's a lot of confusion around this journal and its entries. A lot of people think that John himself wrote it, but that's not the case. It was actually Richard. Now, let's sit with the primary source evidence. So here's a breakdown of the law of what happened when Jackson's men descended upon the Bell farm in 1819. The wagon's unnatural standoff as Jackson and his men trekked from Nashville to the farm, their heavy supply wagon suddenly ground to a complete halt right at the property line. Despite the horses straining against the load, the wheels would not move, and there was absolutely no mechanical or physical explanation to be found. Obviously, they checked to see that it hadn't sunken, nothing lodged in the wheel, all those kinds of things, but they found nothing. So it wasn't until he heard a disembodied, mocking laugh which echoed completely through the air, and then eventually gave them permission to proceed, and then the wagon finally moved. One of Jackson's soldiers was quite confident, claiming to be a witch layer, armed with a silver bullet meant to take down any spirit that dared cross him. But when the entity began tormenting the family that night, that confidence just evaporated. He was met with an invisible, brutal force that beat him across the face and literally tossed him right out the front door. These were hardened, trained soldiers, but they were no match for the relentless scratching, vocal taunts, and physical assaults that plagued them all night. Jackson had initially planned to stay for a full week, but his men had seen quite enough. They packed that wagon at the first sign of dawn and refused to spend one more second on that property. Honestly, you don't mess with an entity like this, not even if you're a general. There were no reports in his logs about this visit, but in the 1800s, admitting to encountering a witch-like force that was invisible and the things that occurred, I mean, I don't think you'd write that down, would you? You're the general, after all, and later the president. I don't think he wanted to come across as a little bit insane. Agatha, the discrepancies in some of the law and what historians found, it's quite staggering, isn't it?
Staggering is a polite word for it, isn't it? We are looking at a masterclass in myth-making, Kelly. The Bell Witch isn't just a haunting, it's a convenient narrative architecture. By externalising the trauma, by blaming an invisible spectral tormentor, the community effectively bleached the bones of a truly domestic tragedy. It turned human cruelty, financial ruin, and the suffocating pressure of 19th century societal expectations into a campfire story so compelling that no one bothered to look at the very real, very human wreckage left behind in that Tennessee cabin. They prefer the ghost because a ghost can be exorcised. They don't know what to do with the rot that starts in the heart of a home.
Mystical investigators, the legend is a mask. It's a beautifully crafted shroud designed to hide the much sadder, much grimmer reality of a social collapse that destroyed a family from the inside out. We do need to look at the evidence left behind by those who were there and those who documented the descent of the family. So, we can start with Martin v. Ingram. This is one of the famous books. His 1894 account captured the terror pretty well. That still haunts the collective memory of Adams, in fact. I'll read his first excerpt that I pulled from the book. The voice was at first low and seemed to be that of a woman, but it gradually increased in volume and strength until it became a loud, clear, and distinct tone, sometimes mocking and sometimes terrifying. It spoke of things that were happening at the moment miles away, and it would quote scripture with the accuracy of a clergyman, only to twist the words into something blasphemous and mocking. The family could not escape it. It was in the walls, in the air, and in their very thoughts. Ingram paints a picture of something that wasn't just a ghost, but an intelligent, malicious force. Now we can contrast that with the more clinical, perhaps more harrowing actually, perspective of Charles Bailey Bell from his 1934 journal. My grandfather, John Bell, did not suffer from delusions. He was a man of the earth, of facts and of industry. When the medicine he took for his health was replaced by a dark, mysterious liquid, and the voice cackled, "It's useless to try to revive him. I gave him a dose last night that fixed him." He knew the end had come. There was no hysteria in his eyes, only the resignation of a man who had fought a war against an enemy he could not shoot or negotiate with. According to some sources, the vial was thrown into the fire, where the flames turned blue, and this was indicative of arsenic poisoning. So, as I mentioned before, there is an account that actually did occur. So whether this was something that was spiritually caused or there was someone much closer to John that perhaps wanted him out the way, we don't know either way how life was for the Bells, really. There is the weight of the investigation. Ingram gives us the folklore, but Charles Bailey Bell gives us the human tragedy. When you hear these words, you realise we aren't just investigating a spirit. We're investigating a family's final, desperate hours. Now, reportedly, the witch gave a 7-year promise. In April 1821, which is not long after John Bell Sr. passed and Betsy finally ended that doomed engagement, the spirit bid the family goodbye, dropping a bombshell that she would return in 7 years. And she was as good as her word, appearing again in February 1828 to focus her attention on John Bell Jr. this time. Though it was with civility, the conversation shifted, covering religion, the origins of life, and even eerie predictions about the American Civil War. John Jr. recorded the entity's predictions. The entity foretold a devastating divide that would split the nation in two. There would be massive bloodshed of brothers. However, historians suggest that these were retrofitted into the retelling of the legend. The 107-year-long game. After haunting the property for about 3 weeks during that 1828 return, the entity prepared to vanish once more. Before she left, she declared she would return in exactly 107 years, which would land us in 1935. This to pay John a visit, most direct living descendant. The mystery of 1935. That direct descendant was Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, a physician living in Nashville. While he did publish the book on his family's history around this time, there are no official records or public records of a grand violent haunting occurring in Adams, Tennessee that year. Despite the silence in 1935, many locals and tourists hold a different belief, that the spirit never truly packed her bags to leave the area for good. Instead, they say she simply retreated to reside in the nearby Bell Witch Cave, where she might still be today. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If she's still hanging around that cave, what does she want? Do you think she would be capable of forming an attachment to someone? Why the cave? Well, a lot of people believe it's the entity's anchor, potentially where she can restore some of her energy. And the Bell Witch Cave is a limestone labyrinth. It's damp, silent, and oppressive. Modern investigators capture EVPs that sound like a woman's mocking laugh, echoing the 1817 reports, and they describe cold spots that defy thermal laws. Locals believe the cave was the anchor for the spirit, and the activity in the house often seemed to correlate with the frequency of visits to the cave. The hauntings' echoes extended even further than this. Years later, in 1852, a doctor experienced some strange rattling in his medicine bag while tending a sick child at the house of Joel. Joel's house was built using some of the logs from the original home. Now, if you follow the paranormal, you will know that things like buildings and things that are in the buildings can gain attachments from the spirits and they can use them as vessels. Even today, the town of Adams, Tennessee is deeply tied to the legend. The area features rolling green hills and farmland, and both the Bell Witch Cave and a reconstructed John Bell cabin. These remain incredibly popular spots for visitors and paranormal investigators alike. In Adams, they also hold the annual Bell Witch Fall Festival. This celebrates the local folklore through theatrical productions and events, which sounds amazing actually. Have any of you attended or do you live near here? Let me know. I'd be interested to talk to you about it if you have. So, I want us to take a breath here. Pause the video if you need to. I want you to weigh up the evidence. We have the hysteria theory, that the social exile and trauma of the Bells created a shared psychological breakdown. But then we have the physical evidence, which is the welts on Betsy, the bruises, and, of course, the death of John Sr. I was discussing this with Agatha earlier, and she brought up a fascinating point. Is it possible we're looking at something like a tulpa, which is like another name for an egregore, essentially? This is an entity brought into reality by the sheer collective intensity of the hatred in that town. It doesn't have to be hate, it's any strong emotion, but the collective of that emotion is known to cause this kind of phenomena. Now, Aggie suggests that the entity wasn't an intruder, but in fact, she was like a mirror and she reflected the darkness that was over the town in that time back onto the Bells. I'm going to ask you, if you lived in Adams in 1817, would you or would you not stand by the bells? After hearing the evidence that I've given you, did your answer change from what it was at the beginning? And that, my fellow travellers, is where the shadows fall when it comes to the Bell Witch. But before we blow out the candles, I do have to say a massive, heartfelt thank you. This community, our mystical investigators, has been growing so incredibly fast over the past week. To every single one of you who has subscribed, liked, and shared the deep dives, my posts, and my lives, you're the reason I can keep unearthing these mysteries, recording them, and passing them to you. Your support means the world to me. And if you've got 5 minutes to subscribe, like my page, the video, it would be really great and lets me know that I'm on the right track and doing the things that you guys enjoy. I also want to say that I'd like to start giving back to those of you who've been consistently supporting the channel. So starting next week, I'll be picking 5 people to receive a special shout out at the end of each episode. So if you want your chance to be featured, it's quite simple. Just leave a comment down below with the phrase Spooky Agatha. And that tells me that you've made it all the way to the end of the investigation. I'll be scrolling through, picking 5 of you at random and announcing your names and your pages in our next deep dive, which will again be next Sunday at 8 p.m. For now, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the dark always listens. I'll see you in the nook very soon.